Okay. All right, everyone. I think we're going to get started here. Thank you so much for coming on this lovely night. This is the second program in our Love Your Alley series. My name is Whitney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library, just here to welcome you. And again, so happy you're here tonight with our program with Josh. I have a couple of announcements. The library does close at 8, but this program may go over longer. So if you could just exit out the auditorium stair doors instead of through the library, but please let me know if you need to use the elevator and I'll take you out the other way. And then also, if you weren't aware, we do have a seed library, and I forgot to mention this last week. We have a native plants section. New this year, so please, and we do have a lot of seeds in that area, so please check that out at some point. And yeah, next week at 7 o'clock we have birdscaping, gardening for our feathered friends. And thank you again to the Love Your Alley Committee for planning such a great lineup of programs. And I'm just going to hand the mic over now to Rebecca. Thanks.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm Rebecca Ness with Green Bexley's Love Your Alley. This is our second class. This is our third class in the Love Your Alley series this year for 2024 Love Your Alley. And tonight, Know Your Niche, Right Plant, Right Place in the Residential Garden with Josh Zingg. And we're very happy to have Josh with us tonight teaching this class for our fourth year of Love Your Alley. And this year, it's all about the birds. The Love Your Alley initiative is about restoring habitat as a community, and this year we're focused on supporting our birds. By the end of May, we will have distributed and installed 5,200 plants. When I said that last week, it was 4,900 plants, but I decided we needed 300 more. So now we're over the 5,000 mark. And our goal was 5,000 plants in 5 years, so we're ahead of that, I'm happy to say. In 2023, we banded together with local schools, working with over 200 students from Bexley High School and CSG. We have a Columbus School for Girls student with us tonight who's interning with Love Your Alley, and she's helping us get very organized for all the installations. And we'll continue working with schools as we move forward, and we'd love for you to join us at plant installations if you'd like to come with us to help get these plants in the ground. Our next installations are on May 10th, which is this Friday, May 28th, and May 29th. Oh, hi, Brett. I'm just seeing you. So our remaining events and classes, Whitney already shared some of them with you. I also want to invite you all to our Love Your Alley Festival. It's this Saturday from 12 to 3 in the Bexley Pool parking lot. It's personally my favorite day of the year. We give away 1,000 native plants. There's a food truck there. There's popsicles. There's music. There's activities for kids and adults, and there's tons of opportunity for education as well. It's just a really great day. So that's Saturday. And then we also have, Josh has a part 2 of his class. On May 18th, we're going to do a hands-on gardening skill class. So it'll be a part 2 to the design class that we're learning today. And that will be in the Alley of the Future. So this year, Love Your Alley is partnering with the City of Bexley on the Alley of the Future, and this alley is located between Stanwood and Remington and Denver and Broad. It's 35 houses along this one alley, and the city is making some changes to the alley, and then Love Your Alley is coming in, and we're installing about 20 or 22 gardens, and we're also painting. Well, professional artists are painting murals. We have 3 murals done. 1 is in progress right now, and we'll do a total of 9 this year. So I invite you to the alley this summer to come and enjoy it and see all the work that's been done. The plants should be beautiful by July. Okay, so let's see what else. I want to say something for a minute about Josh. I've been very fortunate to work with Josh in my yard on a few different gardens. I was lucky enough to see the beautiful eco-rich yards that he's worked on in Bexley, and as soon as I saw the yards that he worked on before meeting him, I knew that I wanted to work with him because his yards are stunning. I had lost sight of areas of my own backyard, and it was overgrown, and the gardening joy was lost, which is not like me. I really, really like gardening. So it was just out of my sight, and I couldn't figure it out. And Josh came in and he helped me reclaim my garden. He dug me out. He taught me lots while we worked together, and now I'm happily gardening in my backyard again. Now in my one that's really close to the alley, to the sidewalk. I spent a lot of time thinking about alleys, but this one's very close to the sidewalk. And this was a garden that I worked and reworked. I mean, picture like lots of crumpled white pieces of paper because there were lots of them. This was the garden that kept me up at night because I couldn't figure it out. And it was delightful, but it was also like, come on, we gotta get this together, right? So I couldn't figure it out. And then Josh came to help. And I'm standing there, we're looking at the garden, and I'm telling him my latest plans, and he's calmly, generously listening to my notions. And then he said, well, what would you think about trying this? And I trusted him, and I did everything he said, and I absolutely love my garden now. And when I look at this garden, it makes me smile. It's flourishing, it's beautiful, it highlights native plants, and that's thanks to Josh. So Josh Zingg is an ISA certified arborist and a certified permaculture designer who has worked all over the Columbus metropolitan area. He has been associated with Scioto Gardens informally for years and came on board officially at the start of 2021. He offers consultation and personally leads all field work for Scioto Gardens site services. Thank you.
She gives me a little too much credit for that garden. She had it mostly started. All I did. Thank you all for coming. So as she said, I'm a certified arborist. Trees are my first love, but we're going to be talking mostly about perennials here because a lot of gardens, that's the focus. There's only so much room for trees, although I still add a few trees and shrubs to my 0.08 acres every year. So it can be done, but we're focused mostly on perennials. So I just want to, follow up. I've been doing landscaping for years. But I, came later into this profession. I worked in restaurants. My degree is in Greek and Latin literature, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. I just want to go into that just because I'm speaking to you now as a fellow gardener, not as an expert dispensing the way things are. This is my experiences, my way of thinking about things, and I want to make sure that I'm not presenting myself as an authority. Gardening is very personal, gardening is very organic, and so a lot of this talk is about how to answer questions for which the first answer is always, well, it depends. It's a very unsatisfying answer, but to give a true and reasoned answer, it depends on a lot of things. So we're going to talk about many of the things on which what plant is the right plant for the right place depends. So to unpack that slogan, right plant, right place generally means, why didn't this plant work? Oh, well, it's not the right plant for that place. Okay, well, that's a fairly simplistic view of it. So to start with, what is the right plant? That starts with you. What do you want out of your garden? That is the first question that you have to answer before you can possibly choose what is the right plant for the place that you happen to have. So you have to start by considering what your goals are for the garden. And that is both goals in output, what you want to get out of it, and goals in input, what you want to put into it. So a lot of the common outputs that people get from their garden are wildlife value, especially in the Love Your Alley sphere. We're trying to support wildlife through the built landscape that we have. But also some people are solely interested in aesthetics. They want to sit outside on their patio and look at it and have it look nice, and that's a perfectly valid goal to have for your garden. Or smells. Some people just really like particular smells at particular times if they're hosting and that sort of thing. Some people are very focused on their products of the garden, and in permaculture, that's very much the focus. What do you get out of it in terms of food or fibers or dyes or just firewood? And then experiences that you get from the garden. So for me, gardening is also a hobby. I get paid for it, but then in my off time, I garden in my own garden because it's fun. So setting yourself up to be able to do something that gives you joy in your own landscape is its own end. And being able to share that with people through education and just have fun is an important thing to get out of your landscape. In terms of inputs, what you want to put into it, that's the even more important question that you answer before you choose what plant is the right place. And the two main inputs are time and materials. So a lot of people ask me, oh, I want a beautiful garden, I want it to be diverse, I want flowers all the time, I want it to be good for birds, but I don't want any maintenance. And that's just not an option. There is no such thing as a no maintenance garden, especially in the world that we live in with invasive plants and climate change and things. A no maintenance garden falls apart really fast. So understanding how much maintenance you can and want to put into your landscape will let you choose plants that will meet your first goal of what you want to get out of it with the amount of effort and time that you want to put into it and a reasonable amount of resources that you want to put into it. It is possible to bring in boulders from Canada and to bring in soil from the Appalachians and to bring in giant trees. You can, but it's not a great idea and it's really expensive. So unless you're prepared to spend a ton of money to move mountains, literally or figuratively, you need to be realistic about what you're willing to put into your landscape and balance getting out of it a good experience, education, yield to what you have to put into it. Time, water, pruning, labor, that sort of thing. So once you've clarified for yourself what you want out of your landscape and what you're willing to put into it, then and only then can you start to pick the appropriate plants. But first, you have to assess the conditions of your landscape. So in order of your ability to influence it from least ability to most ability, the main factors of your landscape to consider are the climate, the sun aspect that you have, the soils, and the available water, and then the last is the existing plant communities on your site. So we're just going to go through those in order. So climate. It is the average weather that we get. So Franklin County was recently reclassified to USDA Zone 6B. The climate zones are based on average low temperatures in the winter. So it only gets about so cold most of the time. There are plants for whom any colder than that, they just die. They'll work for a few years and then you have a bad year and they're gone. Buddleia, the butterfly bush, is one that's like this. Some years it just dies to the ground because it's just too cold. So 10 years ago, when I took some plant classes at Columbus State, we had just been reclassified into 6A, which is a slightly colder climate. And 10 years before that, we were 5B. So 10 years from now, I can't say that we're going to be 7A, but the trend line is moving in that direction towards warmer winters, hotter summers, wilder swings between low and high temperatures. So your ability to influence the climate directly is fairly small, but it will change on you without you doing anything. So accounting for the direction the climate is moving without our effort, or because of our efforts, but something you can't change, is important. So thinking about hotter, drier summers, hotter, drier springs. We had some really intense June weather in April. Not as many April showers as we're used to. So thinking about that and accounting for, especially during the establishment phase of new plantings, you're going to have to do a little bit extra if it's 70 degrees and sunny in April, which it was, and that was so weird. So that's the first thing you have to understand is what your climate is, what our climate is, and that's set 6B, getting warmer. So the next thing you have to account for is the sun availability that you have. And this is fairly straightforward. Full sun plants require 6 hours or more of direct sunlight per day. And then there's sort of a squishy area called part sun, part shade. In general, part sun is 6 to 4 hours, part shade is 4 to 2 hours, and then full shade is anywhere that gets less than 2 hours of direct sunlight. If it gets no direct sunlight, that's sometimes called heavy shade, and that's a very special case because that doesn't happen often in nature. The shade that comes through trees is usually dappled, and as the sun moves, you get sort of a low angle thing in the early part of the day or the late part of the day. Full shade is mostly a product of buildings, which are a later invention in the world of plants. So understanding how much sun you get and also the quality of sun that you get is important for plant selection. So I say not all shade is created equal. So to expand on the shade from a structure versus the shade from a canopy, the tin tree species, if you have a black locust or a honey locust, that's a very open and airy tree with a very small leaves. It's a dappled shade. A Norway maple, especially the crimson kings with the dark purple leaves, that's a really hard shade. So when they're very full, that's a big difference. Even if it's, oh, well, it's just under a tree, those two trees make a big difference. Which tree? And then neither is as hard of a shade as a two-story building. So dappled shade, heavy shade, and then even more is the shade underneath an evergreen. Another question I get a lot that doesn't have great answers is, what can I grow under pine trees? And usually when people say pine trees, they mean any evergreen, but pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees, any evergreen. That is a very short list because the evergreens don't want anything living under there. That's why they're evergreen like that. So, especially hemlocks. If you go into southern Ohio and you go to where there are mature hemlocks and you look what's growing under the hemlocks, it's rocks. There are beautiful boulders, occasionally with mosses and lichens on them, and not a whole lot else. Because the shade is so dense, that's one of the reasons why a hemlock forest is considered a climax forest, where once the forest has progressed to being dominated by hemlocks, that's the end of the line because nothing else can grow in the shade of the hemlocks but other smaller hemlocks and rocks. So having realistic expectations of what you can grow in your conditions, it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can grow, and there are some very beautiful rocks to be had. And I'm being, being a little cheeky here. There are some plants that will work in dry shade, but there's also the moisture thing to consider with under evergreens. And then another aspect to consider is seasonal shade. So a lot of people, especially, show of hands, who is in Bexley, a Bexley resident? Bexley is a very leafy city. So a lot of Bexley properties are relatively small, many mature trees, which makes it a lovely neighborhood to live in. But that means that most of the year you're almost fully canopied, except for maybe a gap over the road or right over your house. Hopefully over your house you have a gap in branches. But in the spring, depending on what species of trees you have, they don't leaf out all right away. And there is an entire niche of spring ephemerals that take advantage of that gap when temperatures are warming, it's rainy, and the canopy has not fully come out and closed, and they do their whole life cycle in that little window before the canopy closes. And then it gets hot and it gets dry and the light goes down and they go summer dormant, and that's fine. But if you know that, okay, I have these giant oak trees, but they don't actually leaf out until mid-May, so I can actually have some really fun spring ephemerals in that brief period, and then a few things throughout the season, and then maybe some stuff in fall after the leaves drop, then you can still take advantage of many of the ecological benefits that these very specialized plants have. A lot of the spring ephemerals have relationships with insects that are also timed based on the season. There's a plant I didn't actually put on this handout called Spring Beauty. It's a tiny little bulb kind of plant. It makes a cute little flower, and there is a specialist bee that only eats the pollen of that one flower, and that flower is only up early in the spring. The bee and the flower have their entire life cycle. It's already done, and there won't be those bees or those flowers until next year. So it's not that you can't have anything, but the things that you have are a limited list, but they're even more special for that. So I tell people when they say, oh, I can't grow anything, all I have is I have so much shade. What you have is a thing that you can't buy, which is mature trees. All the money in the world won't buy you an 80-foot tall oak tree. So just understand that the niche provided, there are still openings in the early and late season, and then there are some winter evergreen things that you can still have in the shade of full trees. And then the last thing is there's a difference in intensity between morning sun and afternoon sun. So especially where buildings are concerned, okay, my house blocks the afternoon sun, but it does get 3 hours of morning sun because the sun's over there and the house is here. So that morning sun is a less intense light. The afternoon sun is more intense because of the angle and because it's just hotter during the day. So the same 3 hours of sunlight in the morning or the afternoon will have a different effect on a plant. And you may find that, oh, well, I got the numbers right, but it's not performing well. That may be because, okay, that afternoon sun is a little bit more intense, and if you move that plant onto the side that gets the morning sun where it's gentler, it'll do better. So understanding the various qualities of light and the various qualities of shade is an important thing to think beyond just, oh, it's shady or it's sunny. So you can influence how much sun your property gets. Please, please, please do not cut down trees so you can plant prairie plants. The ecological trade-off is not good. If you have lawn, please turn it into prairie. If you have trees, please keep the trees. There are things you can do. You can have the canopy thinned, and that's good for the health of the tree. You can have the lower limbs of a tree that's planted out in a lawn area raised above head height so you don't hit them while you're mowing, and also to let more of that early or late afternoon low angle sun. But do not take down trees to get more light. One of the reasons I left full-time arboriculture is because there were some situations where I wasn't the boss and I was on the tree's side in a dispute where the tree lost. So, and I didn't get to say no. So there are some things that I had to do that I regret now still and think about. So, yeah. So after that, understand the light that you have, understand the levers that you do have to affect that light, and then embrace the limited palette of plants that that light gives you. The next thing, based on your ability to affect it, is the soils that you have. So in Ohio, in general, we have basic alkaline soils up to neutral. Especially in an urban environment, it's a lot more neutral because a lot of the soil that we have is just the buildup of many years of leaves and people gardening and working it intensively. So if you go outside Columbus into a field, it's going to be much more alkaline than you might get in the city, but that's highly variable. So a lot of the most common garden plants really kind of prefer acidic soils, basic to or neutral to acidic. Those plants became popular because they were planted in the highly populated areas of the East Coast and of the UK where it's acidic. So that expectation is, oh, well, that's what garden soil is supposed to be. That's not what our soil is. So the things that are native here and adapted here will perform better than the things that you might see on HGTV or on British gardening shows and things. It's not that they can't work, but understanding that the conditions that we have are going to make it tough for certain things. So I'm from West Virginia originally. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains in the northern edge of the Blue Ridge, surrounded by azaleas and rhododendrons. I love them very much. I've tried to grow them several different times. They keep dying. So it's not that you can't have them. I've seen some beautiful ones in Clintonville, but it takes a lot of effort. And for the amount of effort that I have decided I'm willing to put into my home garden, azaleas and rhododendrons are not an option. So I just don't plant them anymore. So unfortunately, when I go and visit my parents, I really love to look at their azaleas and rhododendrons, and that's how I enjoy them. Another factor in Ohio soils is clay, which I'm sure anyone who has put a shovel in the ground recently is familiar with. So that is a result of the glaciation of Ohio, erosion, runoff, silting from rivers. That's just what we have, and also a factor of the bedrock. So Bexley specifically is on a shale bedrock. Shale is clay that's been pressed down real hard, and when it gets broken up by erosion, it becomes clay again. So the thing that is good about clay is that clay soils have a high availability of the nutrients in them. The bad thing about clay is that they hold water and don't let go. So many plants really don't enjoy that. They want to get water, and then they want the water to drain away. And in the heavy clay areas, river bottomlands, the water just sticks around in a way that many plants just can't stand. And if you've ever had boxwoods that died or butterfly milkweed that died and you pulled it out and the root was stinky and black, that's root rot from the soils being too wet for too long. There are plants that love that. And if that's the soil you have, you can amend the soil over time and you can loosen it up by adding organic matter and working it and putting different plants in it. Or you can plant the plants that just drink that water up and love it. So that's another point on the input thing. How much effort are you willing to put into making your soil different than it is? I won't say better because every soil has its own reason for existing. But if you want to change it, you can. But it's important that you do a soil test first before doing anything drastic, and that you make your changes in the minimal effort possible for the maximum effect. Don't excavate all your soil, dig it up, bring soil from someone else, dump it down. That's just not worth it. Use that money for something better than it would take. Use that fossil fuels of the diggers to do something else. So one of the things that is often done is adding organic matter, and this is almost always a good idea. I say almost always because there are a lot of the prairie plants that are adapted to nutrient-poor soils, and garden soil is often too good for a lot of prairie plants. And so what they do is they grow really big and then they fall over because they're not expecting that much available nutrition. So Some people, I've told people this, and they say, what do you mean it's too good? I've been working on this soil so hard. It's like, well, it's too good for those plants. And understanding that is another aspect on choosing right plant for the right place. And there are some specialty uses of gardens, like gravel gardening, where you really don't want to add extra organic matter because that ruins the whole point of having a gravel garden. That's a sort of a special thing if anyone wants to get into a 6-inch deep gravel gardening. It's fun, but you can't let the organic matter add or else it defeats the purpose. So once you understand your soils, the next thing is understanding how much water you get. The average for Ohio is about 32 inches a year. That's a nice, solid, temperate climate. We're great. We're in this nice, sweet spot. No droughts, not really a lot of floods, no wildfires. It's great. But the trend has been towards fewer, more intense rain events, longer periods of hot, dry weather. So the plants that lived for many thousands to millions of years with a fairly moderate rainfall are now getting hit with 4 inches and then none, and then 3 inches and then none, in a way that they are not coping with well. So you are going to have to help plants in certain circumstances deal with the extremes of weather that are out of our control. It's fairly straightforward to add water to your landscape. You put water on it. You get irrigation put in. You go out and water. It's not complicated, but you have to understand, do you want to do that? Some people enjoy watering their landscape because it's an opportunity to be out there in nature and hear the birds and see the butterflies and check on the health of their plants, and they have a garden that is intensively planted in a way that does require supplemental watering, and they like that. Some people don't want to water ever, and that's also fine. But choosing plants like hydrangeas often require quite a bit of water. I used to have one in my garden that we called the dehydrangea because its job was to wilt first and tell me that we need to water that garden. I got rid of it and I put a better hydrangea there so it doesn't wilt. So how much can you do? And then sometimes people have problems with the spot that gets too much water. That's usually the neighborhood drainage pattern moves the water in such a way and then it hangs out in a low spot for longer than they'd like, and only if it overflows does it continue on its way and the spot never dries out. That is inconvenient if you want to grow lawn to play soccer on, but it's great if you want to grow plants that are adapted to seasonal flooding. A lot of the spring ephemerals really want a wet spot in the spring. When it dries up in the summer, they don't mind because they're already done. And there are a lot of trees and shrubs that will benefit from a wet spot. Willows, buttonbush, things like that, swamp milkweed, love a wet spot. Don't mind once they're established that it dries out in the summer, but they can what you expect to get, knowing that you're going to get something you don't expect, either too much or not enough, and then balancing how much you're going to have to actively water with making subtle changes like smoothing the grade out a little bit so that that low spot isn't the low spot anymore and the water continues on its way. That's a fairly passive action. It takes a lot of effort up front, but then it just works. So you can have a long-term impact with a relatively small massage of the landscape. If you're willing to do that, it's a lot cheaper in the long run than buying an irrigation system or having French drains put in. Yes. Am I going too fast? Is everybody good? Everybody hear me? Okay. So once you've assessed your climate, the sunlight, the soils, the water, the last thing to assess is the existing plant community that you have. So one plant that a lot of people are afraid of is black walnut trees. There is great fear of the black walnut toxicity affecting other plants. I find, in my experience, that this is very much overestimated. Lots of things that are not on the black walnut tolerant list grow just fine in the very proximity of black walnuts. The black walnut toxicity exists in nature largely to affect other black walnuts, so that when the black walnut tree drops all of its black walnuts sort of right there on the ground, they don't germinate very much right in the drip line of their individual tree. So it's preventing competition from its own young. It doesn't want to discourage your roses. It wants to not be surrounded by a bunch of younger, more vigorous black walnut trees. It does have that side effect on some trees, but it's not as bad as you think. It's worth trying most things, and if it doesn't work, maybe you can blame the black walnut, but usually not. So, and the other thing is just the existing community that you have dictates What open spaces do you have to plant in? Often that will be the main determinant of how much shade do you have. Oh, well, I've got this big oak tree, so I can only do so much. Just understanding that the oak tree is more of a resource than it is a hindrance, and understanding the way that your existing plants have been behaving will tell you, okay, I have a hole physically there by the house, or I have a hole in June when nothing's doing anything. You have to really understand what's already going on in your landscape to know what the action points are to have a good ecological impact without disturbing things that aren't broken. You know, you don't necessarily want to tear out everything and replace it with all natives. Sometimes you do. If all you have is burning bush and boxwoods, definitely tear those out and replace those. But there's a lot of things, even non-native things, that are perfectly reasonable. They don't interact negatively with the ecology. They support pollinators. So taking a realistic assessment of what you have will tell you where you can have the greatest impact and where you don't need to make changes. So most residential landscapes will mimic the natural landscape in some ways. There are a few, balcony terraces. There's not really an analog for that. I mean, I guess there's probably a little bit of dirt on the edge of a cliff somewhere where there are things that are adapted. But for the most part, the residential landscape will fall into one of the major categories of ecological communities for temperate regions. So the end game for most areas that are temperate climate and get good rain is forest, specifically closed canopy forest. So especially in Bexley, that's probably what a lot of you have, is just trees all the way down. In a closed canopy forest, the mature trees are touching or almost touching, so they're casting very heavy shade. There may be little pockets, especially provided by our structures, where you'll get some part sun or some part shade, but often it's dominated by full shade. And there are things, even though I talked about how there's not a lot that grows in shade, there are plenty of things that do grow in shade. It's just a shorter list. And just appreciating that while there is a diminished plant diversity in a closed canopy forest, there's a much greater wildlife diversity, especially the invertebrates, which are key to supporting birds in the life cycle of fledgling young, which can't yet eat berries or seeds. They can only eat soft-bodied insects. The majority of soft-bodied insects grow on trees, feed on tree leaves and sap and things like that. So the trade-off of, well, there's fewer plants I can plant, but I'm getting so many more different insects from these mature trees, is one that is ecologically better to have the trees. Then sort of working back in time from what all things eventually want to be if allowed is an open woodland. So this is on its way to becoming closed canopy, but it isn't there yet. There might be open glades created either by trees that haven't filled in yet, or by a big tree that has died and has created a pocket of space and time of greater light availability. Plants and then perennials that are adapted to the various niches, the wet low spot, the little sunny spot, the edge. So there's more diversity, but also still quite a high diversity of insect and other animal life. And then the savanna, which is what most residential landscapes most closely mimic, is relatively open country, grass dominated, with some trees here and there, some shrubs here and there. This is a house with a lawn and a few trees in it. That's basically a savanna. The only problem is the lawn is ecologically dead. If it was a few trees and sedges or native grasses, slow-growing perennials, there'd be a lot more going on. But overall, most landscapes, especially outside of the urban area where lots are small, bigger suburban lots are basically savannas. And there's a lot that you can grow there. There's a lot of opportunities because so much of it is full sun. Full sun is the largest list of options. And then rolling back from savanna, scrubland. This is where there may be some smaller trees or thickety shrubs. That's a great and undervalued habitat. Even the name scrubland kind of sounds derogatory, like, oh, scrubland. But it's really important, especially for birds. There are a lot of birds which do not nest in big trees. They nest in little tangled thickets. And a lot of our management practice looks at tangled thickets as ugly. And we want to get rid of that and just clean that up. But a cardinal would really like to get in that thicket. That's a nice thicket for a cardinal. So areas where you may not have large trees, but you do have room for thick, dense shrubs, viburnums, things like that, is a valuable resource, and especially for birds is very useful. And then you also have the open area in between those shrubs where you have access to the full suite of perennials. And then back from that is what's called old field or the forest edge. And so this is kind of through the lens of human land use, where pasture land that gets left alone sort of gets tall and weedy, and then eventually a few trees come in, and then eventually it becomes scrubland. So that old field is a very useful, and this is, the property without trees yet. You have a lot of options. I suggest you start putting trees in there because it's a little boring, but that is what scrublands grow out of. And then roll back from that is the prairie and the grassland. So this is what a lot of our perennial gardens mimic. Most prairies are 70, 80, 90% grasses and a very small number of flowering plants when they're mature. That's because the grasses are winning. And they win because of various evolutionary strategies, really deep roots, a slightly better photosynthesis mechanism, smothering everything with their dead foliage every year. It works. Over time, a prairie will become almost all grasses. The reason that the western prairies stayed prairie and didn't eventually become scrubland and trees was a combination of natural processes, fires, the movement of large herds, and artificial processes, again, fires and cutting. So when we have a perennial garden that doesn't really include very many grasses, because as gardeners we are very flower-centric, we are holding the prairie in a sort of infancy. And often you'll notice the weeds that you get in a perennial garden are kind of grassy weeds. And that's because they want to win. And so if we want to keep it in that pretty, colorful, flowery state, it requires effort. And that goes back to the inputs. If you want to have flowers all year round, you totally can. But it requires that effort, because what nature wants is to eventually push that towards mostly grasses. And those grasses do provide a ton of ecological impact. And we'll talk at the very end about carex, which are the sedges. And they're grass-like. They're not really grasses, botanically speaking, but they're grass-like. And they're very important and often overlooked. And then there are some other ecotypes that you might find in the residential landscape. If you have a stream that is one edge of your property, you get some riparian area. If you have a really wet spot that's wet all the time, you can have sort of bog conditions. If you have a beach house, you have coastal things. But mostly this is not the average. If you have a beach house, can I come? So, understanding that most properties are somewhere in the open woodland to savanna, and then a lot of the garden elements within that landscape may be in the prairie grassland world analog. That will let you choose plants appropriately and understand what those plants are going to do. Because the next part of this is seeing plants not as passive objects, but as active agents in the landscape. So every tree, every blade of grass is moving all the time, not just blowing in the wind. They're getting a little bit longer, they're getting a little bit bigger, they're getting a little bit stronger all the time. It's too slow for us to see, but it's happening. So the mistake that many people make, especially many professional accredited landscape designers, is to treat plants like furniture. And if you arrange them on paper in the land of perfect circles, and you say, I'm going to put this river birch right here by the corner of the house because I got it real cheap from the landscape nursery, and it's going to look great there for the first few years, eventually it gets huge. And one of the multi-stem limbs is over the house, and it has to be cut off. And now you have this awkward, unbalanced thing, and well, now I have to cut off another one, and pretty soon you have a big empty space and a stump, because someone thought it would be great to put a little river birch 5 feet from the corner of your house in the land of perfect circles. So the landscape is a thing that moves and changes. One of my plant teachers, Deb Kanapke, said that landscape design is like sculpture in 4 dimensions, because you have to account for change over time. And that's a really great way of thinking about it. I've also heard it called the slowest of all performing arts. So just remember that your landscape is a dynamic process, and if you want it to look the same way all the time, that again takes a lot of effort. You can, topiary, you can do it. You can make the hedge stay elephant-shaped, but it takes a lot of effort, and if you ever stop, the elephant's gone. So understanding the dynamism of a landscape is important, to not be surprised by or disappointed by the changes that will happen in your landscape. Understanding that it's a natural process will make you appreciate it and be like, oh, wow, it's so different than when it was. So the sunlight will increase or decrease. Big tree dies, a lot more sunlight. The hostas under that tree, not happy anymore. Have to move or have to die. Or alternatively, the little tree that you just bought 10 years from now is now a big tree. And now the sun perennials that you planted with that tree when it was little, not happy. So plants that are getting too little sunlight will often still live, but they won't really be flourishing, and you can expect diminished flowering and sort of a sparse, leggy growth. Often perennials will elongate the distance in between their leaves, just trying to find the light somewhere, and it just is awkward and they fall over. Plants with too much sunlight can get stunted growth where they receive their maximum needs without much effort, so they just stop, like, well, I don't need to grow more leaves, I'm good, I've got what I need. Or they'll get totally crisped up, or they'll grow too much, and this is often the case for that tree planted out in the middle of the lawn, because that tree expects to be in a forest and to grow as a seedling in a forest. I'm not a scientist, so I'm allowed to anthropomorphize plants. That red maple tree in your lawn expects to be in a forest, and when it grows in a lawn, and that lawn is perfectly mowed all around it, it has so much sun that it'll just stack branch on top of branch on top of branch, and it gets really big and thick, and then those branches aren't very strong, and it grows really fast, and then it breaks in a storm or something. So sometimes too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and that can be the case with sunlight. And the management of young trees in a full sun environment is very important in their youth, and there's a whole other talk that I do in spring when it's pruning time. So when you're looking at choosing plants for your landscape, the requirements for soil, it's a guideline. You know, if it says, oh, it prefers neutral to acidic, you can try it. You know, I tried a lot of things. It varies plant to plant. They say that as a gardener, you don't really know a plant until you've killed it twice. So I do encourage you to try and occasionally kill plants just to get to know them, even if you do eventually decide, no, I guess I can't have those. Don't get too stuck on, well, it's the paper says I can't have it, because the plants don't read the papers. This also goes for water. Plants can be pretty flexible, especially once they're established. A plant that, you know, seems like it might need more water could actually probably survive a drought with just a little bit of supplemental watering or luck. But that establishment phase is critical. And sometimes the establishment phase can be up to 3 years for a new planting. So, you know, the first year is super critical, but that second and third year can be just as important for making sure that a plant that didn't just happen there naturally can grow to be strong enough to take care of itself. So landscape design is inherently artificial. Lots of plants that never would have met in the real world are put next to each other in conditions that would never exist in the real world. So it's not unreasonable to expect a little bit of artificiality in getting the ball rolling. With proper plant selection, that ball will continue to roll on its own, but you do have to push it sometimes for 3 years. So in assessing a plant, there's a really nice sort of shorthand for figuring out what a plant wants in terms of water, and that's the wetland indicator status. So this is a classification that the USDA uses, and it's based on how likely a given plant is to be found out in nature in a wetland site. It's not a perfect metric because you have to go and find it, and there's lots of stuff that's probably out there somewhere and no grad student has wandered on it and found it. But in general, you can use the wetland indicator status marker to tell how you should expect the plant to behave. So in order from wet to dry, obligate wetland plants, you only ever find them in wetland sites. Some of those wetland sites may be only wet seasonally. So certain things grow in that low wet spot in the woods in spring, and then they go dormant. So it's not that the spot has to always be wet, it's that during the life cycle of that plant, it needs it to be wet. And especially it needs it to be wet for its seeding. A lot of the spring ephemerals, their seeds are hydrophilic, which means that they cannot dry out. They need to drop onto wet ground and germinate right away. So if you save bluebell seeds and let them be in a little paper envelope all winter and try to plant them next year, it's not going to work. Those seeds need to drop on the moist spring soil, germinate, and then next year you may see more bluebells. So then facultative wetland, those are usually in wetlands. They really like it. These are the things that will benefit from the extra juicy spot. They don't absolutely need it. They're usually okay with drying out occasionally. The middle of the road is just facultative plants. You can find them anywhere. Lots of trees are like this. Upland, lowland, wetland, sideland. I don't think that's a thing, but they'll grow anywhere. Facultative upland, those prefer to dry out, and generally it's not that they don't want water, it's that they need to dry all the way out. So that clay soil that holds water for a long time is a big problem for facultative upland and upland plants. They do still need water. It's not like put this in a spot where it never rains. That's for cactuses, and even cactuses need some rain. So it just means that they can't stay wet for long. And then the upland plants, it's like that, but more so. So, you know, your butterfly weeds, they love a hot, dry spot, but they just cannot stay in wet, claggy soil for too long, or the root will rot and then they'll be gone. So using those metrics, you're able to sort of assess, okay, I have a ballpark estimation of how this plant will behave in my landscape. I know that I have that spot that gets wet in the spring, dries out in the summer, might get wet in the fall, we don't really know. So the plants that are facultative wetland will probably do well there, but then you do have to experiment because all sites are different and it depends. So the next thing to consider, we're almost there to actual plants. The next thing to consider is, what is this plant's reproductive strategy? Because that will tell you how it is going to behave in your landscape. So, you know, broadly speaking, most plants, almost all plants, they make seeds, they grow new baby plants. But a lot of them also have non-reproductive ways of reproducing themselves by forming clonal colonies from their roots, that sort of thing. But more broadly speaking, there are three general ways that plants will persist in a landscape. And this is described in a triangle called the CSR triangle. So C is competitive. These are most garden plants. What they're going to do is they're just going to outplant all the other plants. Sometimes that means one individual is going to get really big and make sure that nothing else will shade it out. Sometimes that means the clonal colonies are just going to dominate an area and nothing gets in here. I'm bottlebrush buckeye, don't come in here. And then sometimes that means prolific seed. I'm just going to blanket this area. It's going to be hackberries for days. Like, those are all options. So I have a few examples here. The black cherry, if anyone has a Prunus serratina black cherry, you know how many little black cherry seedlings come up underneath those. Not all of those are going to make it, but if you didn't pull them out, enough of them are going to make it that there will still be black cherries there for many generations. Downy sunflower is another one. So that one dominates by rhizomatous growth. It sends its little root suckers out and they grow up. So when you see a big patch of downy sunflowers, those are often basically the same downy sunflower. Anisysup, that one is an aggressive self-seeder. If you really love it, take one seed head and go like this, and you'll have it forever. Oh, that was the microphone. And then northern sea oats is a great plant for repairing eroded stream banks. And it both does rhizomatous growth, and that's what holds the stream bank, but it also makes a ton of seed. You won't have an eroding stream bank, but you will have only northern sea oats, which is fine. It's better than an eroding stream bank, but don't put it in your rock garden. So also, all of these QRC codes will take you to the Scioto Gardens website where there's pictures, stats on these plants, more information than I could fit on the paper. So these should all work. I checked most of them, but yeah. So then the second strategy that plants use is stress tolerance. Stresses for plants are not enough water or no one else wants to live. Then they don't have to be competitive because no one else wants to live there. So I keep talking about it, but it is a question I get a lot. The butterfly weed, the Asclepias tuberosa, that one wants high and dry sites, places that are tough for other plants. The opposite side of that coin is marsh marigold, Caltha palustris. It likes to live in a place that gets totally covered with water, and it can actually live under 6 inches of water during the spring. You'll see it down there with its leaves and flowers, and then eventually, when the stream recedes, it will have completed its life cycle. It may go summer dormant, or if it stays wet, it'll be fine. But most plants can't live underwater, so it occupies a niche that has relatively few competitors. Lindera benzoin, the beautiful spice bush, it is a great shrub for dry shade, which is the toughest of all niches, the dry shade niche. Once established, spice bush will do very well in dry shade. So it's another area where it's like, well, it's only me around here, so it's easy. And then fragrant sumac is a great stabilizer of high exposure slopes. So places where recent construction has been done and there's just this sort of pile of clay and rocks, fragrant sumac would love to grow there and not a lot else. And that's fine with fragrant sumac because it's also a clonal colonizer. So it will send out root suckers, it will dominate that slope, the slope will not rush into the road, and there will be all sorts of fun ecological interactions. The last one is the weirdest one. The term is ruderal. It's a little jargony, so it's essentially disturbance that is required for the life cycle of these plants. So disturbances are fires, floods, the passage of 1 million buffaloes, people actions, these things. So the strategy of these plants usually is to make a lot of seeds when the times are good, and then those seeds wait for the times to be good again. So cardinal flower, that's a wetland sort of plant. It grows nicely in the sort of openings in a wet woodland, makes a beautiful flower, makes a lot of seeds. Eventually that opening closes because the trees grow in. Then when a flood comes through and takes away the top layer of soil, if there is an opening, those seeds are now exposed, they grow up, they be cardinal flowers, and then they do the cycle again. In the garden landscape, don't usually get floods or herds of buffalo, so cardinal flower is a plant that will often vanish from your landscape after a few years. That's because it is not sufficiently disturbed. So sometimes where you have a big patch of cardinal flowers and you know they've gone and seeded, it's important to go in and just roughly rake the surface of the soil every season, just to make sure some of those seeds are being brought to the surface to continue a cycle that, absent that disturbance, would stop. Wild columbine is another great plant. If you've ever seen it, they seed prolifically. They'll be great in a few years, and then you realize, I haven't seen any columbines in that area in a while. And that's, again, it hasn't been disturbed enough. The thing they are usually spurred to action by is erosion or the passage of animals. So we are the animals in the residential landscape for the most part. So sometimes you just need to go in and disturb where the columbines used to be, and you'll get columbines again. Royal catchfly is specifically adapted to germinate after fires. We put out most of those fires, so that doesn't happen as much anymore. But it's another one that in the garden might end up being relatively short-lived, and you have to push on it a little bit to make those seeds germinate. Don't set fire to anything, but know that it's going to require extra effort to make sure that it continues to complete its life cycle after your garden has started to mature. And the last one of our great evergreens, Juniperus virginiana. It is one of the first to recolonize after clear cuts. That's about as disturbance as it gets. Their seeds are dispersed by birds. The birds fly over the clear cuts and are sad and poop. And the evergreens are tough enough to come up in that disturbed site and dominate and then create the conditions that other forest species can emerge from. It doesn't mean that you need to clear cut a place for them to grow. It's just in nature, that's their long game strategy, is to take over a place that has been wronged in some way by fire or flood or landslide or people. So now that we've gone through all the factors that determine what your site is like, how a plant might behave, what to expect out of it, what you want out of it, now we can talk about actually placing some plants in your landscape. And there are ways to think about what you put where that will make a better experience for you. It's not that the plant won't grow well if you don't arrange it right, but if you arrange it optimally, your enjoyment of that arrangement of plants will be increased. So, just how to physically fit plants in. We're thinking about size, we're thinking about color, we're thinking about texture. These are all things gardeners are very used to, but we can't forget the life cycle of those plants. Because if we predicate our landscape design on, okay, this clump of this color is here, and then this clump is here, and this one is an aggressive self-seeder, soon that color is everywhere. So it's not that that's not a useful strategy, it's that that's not a useful strategy for distinct color groupings. One example of just creating interest in a relatively small space is by purposely putting contrasting colors and textures together. So one of my favorite go-tos for somewhere like a condo that just doesn't have that much room is to pair some cultivars. I'm a pro cultivar person. Again, this is an it depends thing. It depends on what the cultivar does. There are a lot of cultivars that are ecologically inert and I don't use, but there are a lot of cultivars that are perfectly fine. often they're smaller and prettier and fit better in the residential landscape. So these three plants, Juniper's virginiana gray owl, it's a low cultivar. It gets about this tall, about 8 feet wide, low, big arms kind of thing. Silvery blue-green foliage. The Guillemot St. John's wort, big irregular blob, about yay high, yellow flowers, light green foliage. And then the Lady in Red 9-bark, about that tall, arching stems, pink flowers, burgundy red leaf color. So 3 different color palettes in the leaves, big triangular leaves on the 9-bark, little tiny oval leaves on the St. John's wort, evergreen leaves and berries on the gray owl. So all 3 of those together, they all like the same conditions, and they're all in the same general size category. And if you group them together, there'll be this little set piece that is interesting because it's contrasting. One of the things our brains are trained to look for is contrast, because that's where there might be something useful for a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer. Like, oh, it's different over there, I like it. I don't know why, but I like it. So using contrasting colors and textures is a good way to hit that button in your brain. Coming off of that, it's important to understand that, like all works of art, landscape design has a certain viewing distance that is expected. So if you've ever gone really close up to a famous painting, it's just smudges of paint. It's just little smears. But then you step back and you see, oh, it's Starry Night, I see now, because you're viewing it from the appropriate distance. This is the same in the landscape. There are a lot of really great naturalizing plants that up close don't look like very much, but viewed at a distance in their normal habitat, they're amazing. So the classic example I have for this is bluewood aster. Its foliage isn't very much. It's a little sort of a heart-shaped leaf. It doesn't do much for most of the year because it flowers in the fall. But when you have a naturalized grouping of it in a woodland, in fall, it's like a blue mist in the understory. It's amazing. But if you get up close to it, it doesn't look like very much. So if you put it in your garden right by the patio, you're going to be underwhelmed. But if you put it over there in the wood line at the base of some shrubs, you're going to love it because you're viewing it from the appropriate distance. Part of that viewing is the canvas on which plants are painted. You can create that through intentional plantings. So this is evergreens, tall grasses, upright, deciduous plants planted at the back edge of a planting will give a backdrop on which other more interesting plants can be painted. So some plants that make good massing plants are the very tall prairie grasses, so Sargastrum nutans and Andropogon gerardii, big bluestem and Indian grass. They're very tall. You can't really plant them right on the edge of something because they're, the foliage is about here, the seed heads are right next to your patio, but back over there, they blend together in a way that then other things in front of them can be highlighted against, and you get their ecological impact, which is high, but you also get to use them as a backdrop for something more showy. Evergreens also work really well for this. We use a lot of tall, upright arborvitaes as a green wall in the urban landscape. There are good and bad choices, and there's okay choices for evergreens, but De Groot spire is one of my favorite because it's very narrow. You can put a line of them at the back edge where you don't want to look at your neighbor's trampoline, and then more interesting things than arborvitaes go in front of those things. You don't want just a wall of arborvitaes. That's really boring. Birds are okay with it, but it's pretty boring. There's a cultivar of the Virginia juniper called Greenpoint. It is the diametrically opposite to the gray owl. So gray owl, low and spreading. Greenpoint, tall, straight. 4 feet wide, 30 feet tall, eventually 30 years. But you can have a tremendous amount of impact in a relatively small silhouette because you're not using that 15 feet above there. You're only using that 4-foot space that you might walk through. So you can have a ton of impact in a small space by selecting a cultivar that doesn't do anything bad and doesn't fail to do the good things that you expect from the straight species. And it's also possible to do this with overall the stems are very vertical, and with just a little bit of pruning you can have a nice glossy green backdrop onto which you will paint the views of other bigger perennials. The shrubby dogwoods are also great like this. I've picked out silky dogwood. It's just fun. It's great fall color, relatively upright. It gets 8, 10 feet tall enough that you can't see over it. It's not evergreen, but most of the time of the year that you're outside, it looks great. So now we're starting to get more complicated and thinking about the changing of plants through time. So speaking about the spring ephemerals, they do a really cool thing, and then they go away. So if all you have is a spring ephemeral in a spot, 3/4 of the year you have an empty spot. And nature does not like empty spots. Nature will put something else in that empty spot. So if you fill the spot first, you don't have to worry as much about what random thing nature might put in that spot to fill an empty hole. So in thinking about how do I tag team these plants through time, I've got 2 combinations, one for shade and one for sun. So the shade combination starts with Virginia bluebells. They're just wonderful. They're just so nice. But they go away. They wilt down, they do their seeding, then they go away. So about the time that Virginia bluebells are going away, Christmas ferns are just making their little fiddleheads, and by the time the bluebells have totally wilted and broken down into the soil, the Christmas ferns are up and great. They're evergreen foliage for the most part. They like the same conditions, shady. They can handle summer dry. They don't mind it if it's spring wet, which is what the bluebells prefer. They hold the space for a long time, and then the blue wood aster takes over with some flower interest in the fall. You won't really notice the foliage because the Christmas fern is there. That's what you will see, but the blue wood aster will be in and amongst them, and then suddenly, oh, there's flowers everywhere. Well, the ferns are flowering. So that's a way that you can occupy the same spot with 3 different plants and not have that lull in interest or an empty space that nature might fill for you. And then a tag team for full sun starts with Penstemon digitalis, foxglove beard tongue, beautiful spring flower. The foliage is sort of a basal rosette, and that foliage is evergreen, so it will hold that ground throughout the season. Flowers are done in spring, and then, for summer, there's a lot of flowering perennials, but I just chose one of my favorites, which is Pearly Everlasting. It has an interesting sort of narrow leaf, very silvery foliage that contrasts well with the big flat leaves of the beard tongue. It is a host for the painted lady butterfly. They'll make little cocoons in the leaves. It's adorable. And it flowers for a good long stretch in the summer. And then I chose a cultivar for its size. This is a cultivar of the aromatic aster called October Skies. It's smaller and less reseeding than the straight species. So you don't have to worry about it going where you don't want it, and it will stay in a purposeful grouping. So you have spring interest and an evergreen ground cover. You have a really nice summer interest with a specific wildlife host. And then you have a stunning fall bloomer, which fall is really the aster's time. So if you want blooms in fall, you're pretty much going to have asters. Moving on from the penstemon, the idea of using a plant as a ground cover is really important and often overlooked. So Claudia West, who's a great landscape designer, said in a lecture, mulch is a bandage for disturbed soil. That's all. At a certain point, you take off your bandages. So the notion that all plants must be surrounded by mulch at all times is a fairly recent notion, and it's a bit misguided. Another designer, Roy Diblick, points out often that no plant evolved to grow in a bed of wood chips. That's just not a thing. It's something that we are doing as a way of suppressing weeds and as an alternative to filling those niches in between the plants that we put there with something else that we put there. We're choosing to put mulch there, and that is the result of, well, that's what everybody else does, and the result of not having really thought through, okay, well, I have this empty spot in between the 2 big plants, I could put something there, and also what I call the mulch. And so they have a financial incentive to put down as much mulch or even more mulch as last year every year. And this is how we get the mulch volcanoes up on trees. This is how we get 3-inch thick layers of pine chips or dyed black mulch that just sheds water and is just dead and lifeless, because it makes monetary sense for them to put it down whether you need it or not. But in an ecological sense, the mulch is the bandage for when you have disturbed the soil by your planting, and it is necessary sometimes to add organic matter. I like to mulch immediately after a new planting with a rich leaf compost. And then for the following seasons, as the plants are maturing but not yet mature, a perennial garden is kind of like a closed canopy. Once they reach edge to edge, the plants are touching, they prevent light from hitting the soil, and usually that light is what causes weed seeds to germinate. If you've got plants from edge to edge, there's just not a lot of room for weeds to pop up. You're not going to get none, but you're going to get a lot less, and you just don't need the wood chips after a while. So intentionally using low ground cover plants, either plants that spread by rhizomes or plants that prolifically seed but are reliably a certain height, is a way that you can have a green mulch that has the effect that wood chips have in covering the soil so that light doesn't hit the seed bank of weed seeds, but also retaining moisture when it rains and looking beautiful. So, I mean, some people like the way mulch looks. I won't judge. But here are some great low-growing ground cover plants, some for sun, some for shade. So plantain-leaved pussy toes is a really great one. Big, fat leaves, kind of like, you know, about that big, silvery, beautiful white flowers, and it just is a spreading mat, and it will just take over an area. Really great for up against a hard edge. Lynn Haven's carpet robin's plantain, another very similar plant. I get them confused because they both have plantain in the name, but they're nice. Salvia lyrata, the lyre leaf sage, is one of my very favorites. So its foliage is about this tall. It's not much at all. It's these big flat leaves that hug the ground. Flower stalk comes up maybe about that tall, and it seeds quite a bit. And it will fill in the empty space in between the stuff you plant originally. So you only need to plant a few, and then you can actually take the seed head and shake it where you want it to go. And it's pretty reliably seed and come up, and eventually it will be this patchwork of lyre leaf sage with other more interesting things come out of it. When those bigger things get bigger, the lyre leaf sage will lose. And that's fine because there's 1,000 more of them. So it doesn't mind if a few individuals eventually get swamped by the growth of your other perennials, but in the meantime, it prevents you needing to cover the soil with something else to suppress weeds. Another one that there's a lot of unnecessary hate for is violets. I happen to love violets, and I cultivate them on purpose, not just the really showy ones, just the common blue violets. I grow them and I use them as a border in my gardens so that I don't have to use a string trimmer, because I can just mow the edge of violets and they don't mind. Those are another great filler of empty space, both by the offsets of their individual roots and also by seeding. So as I'm transitioning an area away from lawn, sometimes I'll just pull out the grass clumps and leave the violets, and then the grass will grow back a little bit, but so will the violets, and eventually it's all violets. Allegheny spurge is the native version of the Japanese pachysandra that you see quite often in urban landscapes as a tough-as-nails ground cover. It has a lot more ecological benefit. It just grows very slightly slower. So it is very rare in the nursery industry because they want the one that grows faster. Landscapers want the one that grows faster. The one that grows faster is cheaper to produce and sell. The ones that are cheaper, the landscapers want. The landscapers plant them. People see what the landscapers plant. They want the thing that the landscapers plant. So it's this cycle that perpetuates a less optimal version of a native plant that we have that's lovely, and it does ground cover for full shade dry. And then Appalachian strawberry, barren strawberry, so-called barren because it doesn't actually usually make a viable berry. It's not a thing you can eat, but it's a beautiful ground cover, pretty little yellow flower, tough as nails, very easy to propagate. When you get a big clump that grows well, you just grab a chunk and you stick it over here and it'll live over there. So you can fill the empty spaces through just transplanting what you've planted a few years ago. Getting more into the, I guess, conventional garden thinking is about, okay, I have all these perennials, now I'm going to arrange them in this new bed that I have made. Which should I put where? I find a useful analogy is the idea of stadium seating. So that's short ones up front, then the middle height ones, and the tall ones in the back. It seems very simple, and it is. And it's not that those plants need that arrangement, it's that you, to view it appropriately, need that arrangement. If you put the big stuff in the front, the little stuff in the back will grow just fine, but you won't know it. So starting from the front row, I have a list of plants for different conditions, each of which will be that small front edge, below knee high. Some of these are only 6 inches tall. These are especially good for where our paved surface, sidewalks, stepping stones, patios meet the landscape to hold that edge in a way that's defined, as opposed to allowing weeds to get in that little edge of the concrete. So sedum tornatum is one of my very favorites. It's just so easy. It is the only native sedum that we have. So all the autumn joys and fun sedums that you see, those are not native, but the sedum ternatum, the shade sedum, is actually native. Very easy to propagate. Grab a clump, put it over here. I especially love to use these in between the roots of a large tree, where there's, a big root going here, big root going here, tiny little pocket of soil, plunk some sedum ternatum right in there. The water from a rain will run down the tree and into that spot. That's all the sedum needs. It will pour out of the tree. It gets covered in white flowers in spring. It's just beautiful. Also great in between rocks, spilling over a stone wall, that sort of thing. Wild ginger, slower to grow, but very rewarding. They're beautiful. They have a neat little upside down flower. They have some special wildlife relationships. Just takes a while to get established, but once you do have them established, nothing else will grow there. So wild ginger is one of the things that can fight garlic mustard and win. It just needs to get started early. And then bloodroot is just a wonderful native plant. It has some specialist insects that go with it, and it is very similar to wild ginger in its appearance. It's just a bigger leaf, and the flower is just so pretty in the spring. So then moving away from full shade to part shade, dwarf crested iris. This is actually a dry iris. Most people think about irises as being for wet sites. This one actually wants a dry site, and it can take part shade and still flower pretty well. A little more sun will be okay, but it actually can't be out in full sun and be perfectly happy. A cultivar, Sherwood purple, is a cultivar of a creeping phlox. It will grow as a mat of rhizomes that put up these nice purple flowers in the spring, and then they maintain the ground cover for the whole year round. It's not exactly pick it up and plant it. You just sort of let it go, and it grows these hair-like surface strands that you can lift and move to get them to go the way you want them. You don't just rip them out and put them in, but you can direct it to where you want it to go. And then foam flower is another one that largely grows just rhizomatously. It will just sort of mix in and around. It needs a little bit of sun, part sun, in that 2 to 4 hour range, but not full sun. Lovely white flower. Moving into part sun, another cultivar of the blue-eyed grass, lucerne. It just flowers more, and it's littler, which is great. It's like an upright little V, adorable little tiny individual blue flowers on top. Great coming out of a stone wall or a border right up against the sidewalk. It's just great. It stays mostly where you put it. They will offset a little bit, but mostly this one, you put it where you want it, and it stays there. You don't have to worry about it seeding. Wild petunia is a great one for neglected sunny spots, like up by the mailbox at the street, where you don't go and fuss around with it because it's not as fun up by the road. It's about this tall, pretty flower in the summer, pretty hardy. It has that silvery foliage that lets you know that it doesn't really mind a drought, so you don't have to water this once it's established. And then another sort of, say, almost spring ephemeral, Jacob's ladder. It will persist a long time if the conditions are right, but if the conditions are not optimal, it will flower, it will seed, it will go away. But in the shady, moist site, sort of that edge of a woods or underneath the drip line of a larger tree, it will proliferate in a way that is nice and full. And then for full sun, these ground covers, or these are front row species mostly, not all ground covers, these are just shorties. The nodding onion, now that one is an aggressive self-seeder, but it is little. The little onion flowers are nodding because the head kind of hangs down. They're great. They will seed prolifically, so you can cut the flower heads off if you don't want them, or you can put the seeds where you do want them, but they are an excellent holder of the front edge. Blue-eye Samsonia, similarly, full sun, only gets about 12 inches tall, summer blue flowers, like a true blue flower. Most people know botanical blue is kind of purple. This is a very blue flower. It spreads slowly, rhizomatously, so it's not a self-seeder. And then GM triflorum, the prairie smoke, it's just a spectacular flower, just to see the little wisps. And then the rest of the year, it's a little basal rosette of fine foliage. So all of these plants will kind of get lost in and amongst Echinacea, Monarda, the more common perennial plants. But in the front row, they will hold that front edge in a way that often makes a fairly disorganized garden look intentional because you've put a frame around it. So by choosing which plants you put at the front edge, that's what makes a painting or a work of art, is you put a frame around it and you put it up for view. So using that front edge to define the perspective is a very effective way of making a perennial garden look on purpose. And that's something HOAs really need. They need it to look on purpose. Middle row species, that's most things. You know, most things are somewhere in the middle. When you're looking at plant tags and plant information and it says its height, usually that's the height of the highest part, and usually that's the flower. So there are a lot of plants that say, oh, this is a 7-foot tall plant, but the foliage is here. Make you choose a plant to be in the middle and not the front row beyond height. Some people are perfectly fine with a border of the path being waist high. That's a really nice look because you have that I'm walking through a field of wildflowers feeling. So sometimes it's not just height that determines what's in the front row. Some plants just lean out in a way that's inconvenient and you just don't want to have to be brushing them out of the way as you go by. Wild quinine is one of those. The flowers are big. They get even heavier when they're covered in all the different bees and butterflies. And so if you're brushing by, you know, a flower covered in pollinators every time you have to go to the mailbox, it's inconvenient. But in the middle of a bed, it sort of fills an empty space and it shades more ground than it physically occupies because of the way it grows. Hibiscus machudis is another one like that. It just wants to be this big, wide bouquet. The actual silhouette of the plant is quite small, but it'll dominate a huge area. And if you don't want it reaching out, don't put it by where your sidewalk is, because it will just do that. That's just what they do. Looks great in the middle, looks great with something surrounding, not great for the outer edge. And then Solomon seal, another great shade plant. Its growth habit is just arching stems. That's just all it does. So if you put it at the outer edge, it will arch over whatever empty space there is because there's more sunlight in your path or on your patio. So think about having it reaching over something else, but not reaching into your space, because otherwise you'll be fighting it, and then we don't want you to be fighting your plants. Another aspect of perennial plant growth that sometimes happens is I call naked ankles. So a lot of plants, as they get bigger and bigger, they're blocking a lot of the sunlight that gets to the base, so they start to just lose the leaves at the base. Every leaf has a cost to maintain, so eventually it's not earning its keep and they'll leave those. So you'll have this clump of naked stems and then all the foliage and the flowers at the top. And if that's the front thing, then you're looking at the naked stems and you're like, oh, that doesn't look great. And also, sunlight is getting to the bare ground and could cause weed seeds to germinate. So it's not providing that covering of the soil benefit that edge-to-edge plants covers. So monardas are like this. If you have a big stand of monardas, over a while the bottom leaves will start to drop off and you'll have, you know, flowers on top, leaves on top, nothing in the bottom. So it's good to have something smaller than that to screen those naked ankles from view. The cultivar that's very popular of Anacisop, the Blue Fortune, popular mostly because it does not aggressively self-seed like the straight species, also does that. So narrow clump, big wide foliage and flowers, but nothing going on at the base. It needs some sort of a surrounding or it looks odd and things will occupy that niche without you. Swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, is another one like this where as it grows in, it loses the bottom leaves. You don't necessarily want to see the ground and the bare stems, so consider pairing it with something else that occupies that up to knee-high area so that you can enjoy the pretty part of the swamp milkweed without worrying about that empty space. And then just a few species that really have to be in that back row. And I'm not just talking about because they're tall, but because where they expect to grow, they're hemmed in on all sides by other things, especially quite dense grasses. So a lot of the tallest prairie plants really need someone to lean on. And if you just plant them out in the middle of a mulch sea by themselves, they won't have that and they'll fall over. So some of these are all amazing plants. The compass plant has like 12-foot tall flowers. The foliage, not very impressive, not very big, but those tall flowers, without the support of a plant community around them, will just fall over. They'll reach in, they'll still flower, they'll still do their thing, but they're not doing the thing you planted them for without an accompaniment that they expect. Sweet Joe Pye is another one. Big, 7, 8 foot tall, huge flower heads. Those flower heads are heavy, especially with a bunch of bees on them. So especially after a rain, a Joe Pye sort of opens up and falls down if it doesn't have something to lean on. So pairing those back row plants with a little cordon of airy grasses like a Panicum virgatum, the switchgrass, is a great way to keep that from happening. And you get the benefits also of the switchgrass instead of having just the mulch that the plant falls down onto. And then the last one is just one that I never get to see enough of in the landscape because there's just not enough sites that can support them, is the Queen of the Prairie. Huge, amazing, like hot pink, hot purple flowers, really great spot. It occupies a low spot in a prairie that's wetter than the rest of the prairie, so it does like a lot of moisture, but it needs somebody to lean on. And if you just plant one Queen of the Prairie by itself, it will be very sad because it will fall over, and you will be sad because you won't get to enjoy it being big and majestic like it and you want it to be. And then we've talked a lot about filling the empty space in between other plants. And again, we're talking about how flower-centric gardening is. A much overlooked category of plants in the landscape is the sedges. So sedges are all plants in the genus Carex. They are grass-like. They're just not technically grasses for botanist reasons that I don't even fully understand. They're just their own thing. So there is a sedge for about every site, but they are picky about what they want. So as you're thinking about your landscape in terms of the flowers, in terms of the celebrity plants, the in-between spaces you can often fill with sedges to prevent that empty space that nature will fill and to provide a foliage and color contrast to the show of flowers that will happen throughout the year. So depending on what site you have will determine what sedge will do well there. A lot of them like it wet, some of them like it dry, many of them like shade. So I've given 3 for dry shade because everyone struggles with dry shade. Carex pennsylvanica, Carex appalachica, and Carex albicans. Pennsylvanica and albicans are also both semi-evergreen. So what that means is that last year's foliage hangs around a long time. It gets a little bit more tattered as time goes on, and by the time the new foliage is emerging, the old foliage is gone. But it will fill that space even through winter. Carex appalachica is just a great dry shade plant, big feathery tufts, and Carex pennsylvanica actually won a trial by Mount Cuba for lawn alternatives. So I often get asked, how can I get my grass to grow under trees? You can't. Like, that's not what the tree wants. The tree is specifically trying to kill your grass. So what you can get to grow under your trees are sedges. And if you plant out a lot of small plugs of Carex pennsylvanica, they will grow and fill in, and as they expand and meet, they will shade the entire soil and they'll suppress weed seeds. And then if you have to, you can mow the area and they won't mind and they'll regrow. And then you will have the effect of a lawn, which is look out, see green, without it having to be lawn grass, which really just doesn't want to grow under trees. And then a few sedges for moist areas. Burr sedge is probably my favorite sedge just because of the big spiky ball seed heads. They're really fun. They're about this tall. They grow in moist woodlands. If you go to the Park of Roses in Columbus, there's a lot of them that grow in the woods next to the pond that they have there. They make such a good impact with their very upright growth habit and those spiky balls. Carex stricta, tussock sedge, that is a rain garden sort of sedge. It wants a wet spot all the time. It'll dry out, it'll be okay, but if you have a rain garden and you plunk some of those in the center, they will have that this is a marsh effect with their growth habit, just the way they look. They look like, a marsh, even though it's a little hole in the ground in an urban landscape. And then Carex socialis, social sedge. I don't know if it's called this for this reason, but it seems like it gets along with everybody. It'll grow in full sun, it'll grow in full shade, it'll grow in wet, it'll grow in dry, it'll grow in clay. It's a good, like if you have to get only one Carex, get Carex socialis, get to know it, make it your friend, and it will not let you down. So just at the very end, I have a few books for recommended reading because if you came to this talk, you were interested in plants, and a lot of what I learned was learned by killing the plants, but also by reading these books from people who know a lot more than me. So The No Maintenance Perennial Garden by Roy Diblick, he is the sedge master. He is a great user and a great person for perennial plantings and understanding the life cycles and the growth habits of plants in order to make a 3-dimensional tessellation of the plants and not just thinking about it as a 2-dimensional land of perfect circles. He's just a wizard, and it's a very accessible book for the home gardener. Planting in a Post-Wild World is more of a concept book than a practical manual, but it's very eye-opening, and it can help you realize the role that you have to play in managing your built environment as a part of the ecological landscape. And part of the thesis is, because of what we've done to the ecology, wild spaces, untouched spaces don't generally exist. And if they exist, you shouldn't go there because that will become a touched space. So what we have are damaged or altered landscapes. And understanding that will help us not limit ourselves to thinking about, oh, we can only preserve what was already there. That time has passed. Garden Revolution by Larry Weiner. He is a real specialist in woodland gardens and the use of shrubs, clonal colony shrubs. The shrub layer, as I said before, is often neglected. People really like trees, people really like flowers. Most people aren't get really excited about shrubs, but if you're a cardinal, you're very excited about shrubs. So it's a great one if you're interested in shrubs or want to become interested in shrubs. And then the last one that you're probably all familiar with, The Living Landscape, Doug Talmy and Rick Dark. He is one of the great champions for ecological thinking in the built environment. Rick Dark is a photographer who's worked with him for years, so there's many good pictures, which I apologize, I don't have good pictures. But it's just a must-read for anyone who is thinking about using their landscape as a part of the broader ecology. So.
And that one is in the back, if anyone wants to check it out from the library.
And if you don't have these other ones, you should get these copies of these for the
I
library.
know, thank you for the reading list.
Yes,
yeah,
you're welcome.
I'll look into that.
And that is the end of my talk. So.
Does anyone have any questions? And we're going to use the mic because we're just recording this. So,
Where do you suggest we go to get the plants that you have listed?
Scioto Gardens Nursery. So that is my direct employer. I have brochures at the back that list how to get to our current site and also list the new site, which we will be opening to the public July 27th. We're expanding into a much larger space. There is still a lot of work between now and then to make it a grand opening, but those brochures will tell you where we are now. We have most of these plants that I've listed are currently for sale. Some of them might already be sold out. I don't know. I don't get into the nursery as often as I should because I'm out in the landscape. But all these links will take you to our website with our full catalog. And there are also a couple good vendors. We sell landscape-ready plants, usually 1 gallon pots, 2 gallons, 3 gallons. We sell trees, we sell shrubs, we sell flowers, we sell ephemerals. Natives in Harmony is another great vendor of native plants, and Gail Martin, who runs it, collects all her own seeds and sprouts all her own seeds. So the provenance of those seeds are specifically Ohio genotypes. So she can tell you, oh yeah, I got this from a guy in Mingo County, you know. So she's amazing. Leaves for Wildlife, Patty Shipley does a lot of great work in the native plant community. Starting Friday, the Chadwick Arboretum plant sale will have a number of our plants there. So Friday, Saturday, Chadwick Arboretum plant sale. And then 2 weeks after that, there's a plant sale by Wild Ones. And I don't remember where their location is now, but if you check out the Wild Ones website, it will tell you where their plant sale is. And if you don't want to drive all the way up to Delaware, we also sell a smaller subset of our plants. They sell some of our plants there. But it's slightly cheaper if you come to us.
I have a lot of rabbits in my neighborhood. I plant things and they disappear. So
Right.
do you have any general guidelines for planting to avoid that?
Well, you know, sometimes it's planting things that the rabbits don't like to eat. Often something with a strong scent of its foliage will also have a strong flavor that they don't like. So a lot of the mint family plants that have a smell, they won't eat. Onions, nodding onions, they won't eat. And then there are also some products that you can apply, variously organic, not organic. We sell at the nursery an organic product called Plant Skid, and it is literally liquid blood. And you spritz it at the base of plants, or there's a granule version too that you put around. And herbivores go, well, I don't eat blood. I'm not going to eat that. Maybe I shouldn't even be in this place. There's blood here. I should probably go. I'm prey. So it works for rabbits, deers, vole, also moose and elk, but it doesn't come up much. It's a Scandinavian product, so they make sure. But it is organic. We also sometimes have used Repellex, which is a not organic product that is a systemic, and it gets a capsaicin flavor into the plant. It works for anything you're not going to eat. So if you put it on your lettuce will taste gross. But yeah, those are the two options we use. But, you know, get a dog. I don't know if Repellex is the same as Repelsol. Probably.
Could I just back up a little bit and have you explain the difference between a native plant and a cultivar? And
Oh, sure.
other than the fact that a native plant is from here,
Right.
I think it's hard to know
Sure.
like what's bad about a general plant that you see at the garden
Absolutely.
center.
So this is another question that ends in it depends. So there are many, so if we're being very technical, there are native plants and those plants evolved here. You can slice native pretty finely. So you might say it evolved on the North American continent. You might say it evolved in the geography that is now considered Ohio. You might say that it evolved east of the Mississippi. These are all relevant biome divisions. But if it's called native, that means it's from here, evolutionarily speaking. That has changed over time. So the Dawn redwood tree was native to Ohio prior to the last ice age. It has now been reintroduced. It's still from North America, so it's not, from China, but it's, if you're being very purist about it, which I'm not, you would not consider that native to Ohio. It would be native to North America, but not native to Ohio. So then some people, I think probably the gentlest term for non-native species is introduced. So it just was brought over by someone, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. If it's benign in its behavior ecologically, you can call it introduced or just non-native without a pejorative sense. If its behavior negatively impacts the broader ecology, then we call that invasive. And so that is things that either occupy a niche to the detriment of other things that would occupy that niche without facilitating ecological relationships that the other things do. So, the burning bush is it looks nice, I guess, but deer don't eat it. And that's useful to an extent, but when you have a plant that the deer don't eat that grows as easily as burning bush does, it will fill empty spaces that other things expect. The non-native honeysuckle leafs out earlier than the native plants and takes the sunlight that spring ephemerals depend on before the tree canopy closes. So it suppresses that particular specialized life cycle and all the other life cycles that depend on that life cycle. So the little spring beauty that has its own special bee, if you run out of spring beauties, you also run out of that special bee. So that's the slicing between native and non-native. There are lots of non-native plants that are perfectly benign. I have many of them on my own landscape. Doug Tallamy says 80% natives is what you should strive for in your landscape. And then of the 20% non-natives, just make sure that they're not the ones that behave rudely. There's nothing wrong with a lilac. They don't do anything bad. They don't do a lot of the extra special good things, but we know that bees use them and butterflies use them. So they're not doing nothing. We know that they have some positive relationships, but most of the native plants also have positive relationships, many of which we have not even studied yet. So with a native, you can expect to not just have the ones we are aware of, but to possibly have more complex interactions that we aren't aware of. So then the cultivar question is another it depends. So a cultivar is a variation of a species that has been kept varied by artificial means. Sometimes that's a true to type thing, which would mean the seeds germinate and do that same thing. And often it's a clonal propagation where they take a cutting and root it, and so they are genetically identical. And that has some implications in terms of disease resilience. If you have a bunch of clones and those clones happen to be weak against a given disease and that disease shows up, all the clones are the same weakness. Some cultivars, when you select for one thing, you're going to get other things that you're not selecting for. Sometimes those are obvious, like there's some double-flowered echinaceas that have like a little poof, and they're named things like bubblegum ball and things like that. That deformation of the flower head prevents the formation of nectar and pollen. So they're not doing something that they would otherwise do. They look different. Some people might like them, I don't, but some people might like them aesthetically. But because they are robbing an ecological service, there are other choices you could make to still have an echinacea cultivar. And Penn State did a real exhaustive study of cultivars, and someone sat on a bucket and counted bees coming to cultivars and determined that many of the cultivars of common garden plants are actually more preferred by pollinators because one of the things that was selected for, in addition to usually flower size and color, the bees like or the butterflies like. So it depends on what the cultivar is for. Many of them are just more flowers, bigger flowers, more berries, different colored foliage. That's a tricky one, different colored foliage. The 9-bark, the lady in red 9-bark that I illustrated, has burgundy red foliage, regular 9-bark green foliage. The caterpillars that eat the 9-bark are green. So on a red 9-bark, they're much more obvious to birds. Bad for the caterpillars, pretty good for the birds. So it's a trade-off. So if you're interested in the caterpillars, then you want the green one. If you're interested in how it looks or the birds, then you're okay with the red one, but it depends. So that's sort of the long and short of it on native, non-native cultivars. Right, and then invasive, just because it's not native doesn't mean it's invasive. That comes down to how it behaves. All right. I went way over. Thank you all for staying. Grab a brochure on the way out if you're interested in stopping by the nursery.